I am going to start this on one of the tutorial sites that I made last year to show you how the header can be animated and how the pages can transition from one to the other in different ways, and also how the footer can be frozen. So this is the first part of looking at animations on Wix. So every element in Wix can be animated, and when you click on, let's say, this, then this does have an animation on it, which you can see because this is green. But this is not just for the elements that are on the page itself, but also the actual big elements like the header, the page, and the footer can also be animated. So let's start with that, and then let's continue on to looking at how individual things can be animated and then also frozen on the page, which is something that I'm also going to get to towards the end of this. So now the header can be animated in different ways. So when you look at the settings here, this little wheel, then it shows you different ways in which this header can be animated. Now, in default, it will be with scrolls with sight or freezes. This sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. But let's start with scrolls with sight. So I'm just going to go to preview, and then when I scroll down the page, then the header just scrolls with it and disappears. Now let's go back. If I freeze it, which is this here, then what happens is that when I scroll down the page, the header actually stays where it is and we can always see it. And then if we go to another page, like this one here, for example, which is longer, so you can see this even more clearly, we are scrolling down the page, and as we're scrolling, the header is staying exactly where it is, which is very useful in some designs. But of course, for this to work, your header has to be narrow, like this one here. If you have a really big, overwhelming, wide header, then this is not going to work. Now let's go back to the editor and let's look at another one. So the header can also disappear, so let's look at how that works. So as I'm scrolling down, now here I haven't had enough, the page isn't long enough for me to scroll down sufficiently, but then if I scroll down a little bit more on a long page, then the header will slowly disappear. It won't just not be there at all, it'll just slowly fade out or slowly move to the back. Then let's look at the fourth one. It fades out. So how does that work? As I'm scrolling down, it slowly fades out. It doesn't disappear all of a sudden, but it fades out very slowly. So that's the fourth animation, so to speak, that you can give to the header. I'm just going to go back to scrolls with sight, and now I'm going to look at the footer here. Now, with the footer, there's only really one thing we can do. We can just freeze it. So when we click this, which is what I've done now, normally the footer is all the way at the bottom of the page and we should not be seeing it at all, but when it's frozen, it will appear at the bottom of the page and it will always be there. Again, this is not something that you would normally do. You would actually do this for very special design effects, and as a matter of fact, I can show you one on another site that I have, which, let me just quickly do that actually. Now on my website I have a sub-site, or a site that is linked to it, where I have used the footer as a header. So this always stays there. This is actually the footer, but in this particular design there's no header up here at all. Instead, the header is made out of the footer and it stays here no matter what page you actually go to. The header is fixed, but it's actually made out of the footer. So that is one way in which you could use this trick of freezing the header. I unfroze it already because on a site like this it's kind of silly to do that. But then there's also something else you can do, which is that you can animate the page transitions. And the way you do that is you go to site design, and then at the bottom here you have page transitions, right now there isn't a page transition at all, but if you customize this, there are certain animations that you can give to a site as you go from one page to the other. So let's look at those real quick. Now, again, let me go to preview. Here's the first page, the home page. Now, if I go to the second page, and then the third page, and then the fourth page, it will move in from the left to the right, like this. Now let's look at another one. And we can't really change the durations of this or anything like that. It's just a very basic transition. So now let's look at the vertical animation. So if I go from here to here, it'll actually fall down. And this usually does not work very well on very long pages, because as you can see, while the content comes down, it sort of gets glitched together. But then you may want to use that as an effect, so that's up to you. Now there's a crossfade. Let's look at that. In the crossfade, one page will fade to the other with a tiny little black period in between, which you can barely see. It's so small. But then let's just look at the last one, which is, sorry, the crossfade actually transitions from one to the other. The out and in works in the way that I was just saying. I just got confused there. So when I click on, let's see. When I click on from one page to the other, there's a small gap in between. So it doesn't fade from one into the other, but in the middle we have like a little white stopping point. So this is actually quite a nice one. The crossfade is a nice one. The horizontal can be nice. The vertical is usually not recommended if you have a page that is very, very long and then things get scrambled up. So this is it for the basic how you can animate, well, quote unquote animate the header and the footer, which you can basically only freeze, and then you can also give transitions from pages to pages. So this is the first part of this tutorial about animation, and now we are going to continue on to the second part. So now let's continue on to animating individual elements on a page. So I'm actually going to go here where I have saved a number of things to my designs, and I'm just going to pull these two here and just move this one to the side. And now let's look at this cat. Now the way we animate things is we click here, this little oblong with the thingies next to it, and right now it's none. So we have quite a good list of things that we can do. It gives you a little preview of how it would work. So puff in would make it come in really huge from the outside. Arc in would do this, fold in would do that, turn in would do this, expand would expand it in. I'm just going to go with bounce in. Okay? Now, once we do that, then we start customizing it. And we have three hardnesses. So it can bounce in very softly, it can bounce in a medium speed, and then it can also bounce in a hard speed, in which case it would be really kind of emphatic, let's say. We can decide on the direction from top left, top right, center, bottom right, and bottom left. So you can't bounce in like straight down and straight across. You always have to bounce in at an angle. Let's look at what happens if you bounce in from the center. You bounce in like this if it's soft, and if it's hard, you bounce in like this. Okay, let's do it from the center. Now, how long does the bounce actually take? You decide on that from here. So the duration of the animation, so right by default it's usually at 1.2, not usually, it's always at 1.2, but you can change that. So let's make it longer and see how that works. So it takes a longer time. Let's make it really long and see how that works. Okay, so but what if I were to make this soft and then really long? Then it would be like this. So there's quite a bit that you can actually do with the duration and then also the power. But then we come to this very important thing, which is the delay. which becomes very important, especially if you have multiple elements that are animated at the same time, which I'm going to get to in a minute, in terms of, not in terms of technique, but in terms of concept. You can give it a delay. So right now what we have is that if we go to the preview, so let's actually do that, this would bounce in right away. However, we can delay this. So if I delay this by, let's say, 2 seconds, it would bounce in, not right away, so we're waiting, but then it would bounce in. There would be a delay. Okay? So we've given this an animation, but the question now is, and that is where multiple elements start to become important. So let's say you have this animation here on your website somewhere, on the home page or something, and let's just decrease the delay. Let's bring it down to like half a second. So it bounced in, and what? And what? I mean, is this terribly meaningful? I don't think so. Now, the way that animations start to become more interesting is if they happen in multiple stages. So we had this one bounce in at half a second, but what about, and then let's see, we had it bounce in at half a second, and then the duration was, I'm going to just make this something that's easy to calculate, so 1.5 seconds. So the total of this is 2 seconds, yes? What about if once it has bounced in, then this comes in and it's gliding in, or it's floating in, let's say. It's floating in from the right, and the delay is 2 seconds because this guy finished his animation at 2 seconds. So once he's finished, then he has to start. So we have to calculate the delay based upon the ending point of this. Okay? And it's floating in from the right, and the duration is 1.2 seconds. Okay. Now let's take a preview. And then the other one comes. So now we have an animation that is actually happening in 2 phases. Now I'm just going to go and look at this. I think it's the fly-in. Yes, I want to change this to fly-in. The duration is 1.2 seconds from right. Okay, now let's see what happens, because the fly-in is going to take a longer time. Whoops, you know what happened? I forgot to change the delay, so it still has to be at 2 seconds, because this one finished at 2 seconds, so this has to start at 2 seconds. Yes? Now let's look at it. And then this one is flying in. So now we have an animation that's in 2 parts. Then there's another thing that you have to be aware of. You can animate something only the first time, or you can keep animating it every time that somebody comes back to this page. So because with HTML5, when you are on a website and you go from page to page, there is actually no refresh process. The whole website is loaded one time, and if you uncheck this, if you have this unchecked, then it will just keep animating over and over again. If you check this, then it will only animate one time when somebody goes to that page and then never again. And that is usually quite a good idea, because you don't want to bore people with having them look at your animations over and over again. So only animate the first time is actually quite a good idea to not do an overkill with your animations. Now let me delete these, because I want to bring in another one, because yes, okay, we had it in 2 phases. However, how about if we have 3 cats, and then let's see, let me just ungroup all of these. All of these have animations, and I have actually prepared this so that you don't spend a lot of time on this tutorial. So let's preview this. So here comes cat number 1 and his thought bubble, then come the other 2 cats, and then come the speech bubbles. So now this animation is actually made out of 4 parts. So just go back. Part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 4. And then you actually have something that takes a longer time. So the last element here needs to come in at 4.1 seconds. So you calculate this, all of this. So the first one is at 0.5 seconds, and then the second one is at, let's see, 1.7, because I added that up, and then the other ones start at 1.7, and then, so you get the idea. You have to animate it. And animations are usually more interesting if they take a little bit of time. So the total time here is something like 5.5 seconds or something for this entire animation, and that is usually a better idea than just to have one cat come in and then and that's it, and nothing else happens. So, but obviously here I didn't put a lot of thought into a kind of a little scenario. You would need to work out a scenario. You would need to have some kind of concept, some kind of idea behind why these are coming in sequence. And so, you know, here the speech bubbles don't really have any text, but you may have things that have text on them. So let me just show you this here, which is one of the other tutorial sites that I made, where actually it works like this. So here there is a concept. I'm asking a question, and it has to do with the whole idea of the angry cat and so on and so forth. And also I have divided the animation into 2 slides. So then comes the second one, and then again there are typographic messages, eat and drink, do a lot of stretching, come on, let's go, like that. And the first one is, psst, are you one of the nervous ones? And then like that. So you have to have a kind of a little scenario for animations to really work. Just something that is just moving by itself doesn't really do the trick. Now let's continue on to actually how we freeze elements, because that is also a type of animation. So let's look at that next. And now finally, pinned elements. Now these are things that you want people to see no matter what the width of their browser is. So let's start with this one here. Now I need to right click on this and then say pin to screen, and it will go to the nearest corner of the screen. So I'm just going to bring it in a little bit, move it up a little bit, and then usually you do this to get people to go to the top or the bottom of the page. Top of the page, done. And then let's give it a preview. So let's pretend that this is a real page, and that we need to go back up to the top. When I click on this, it'll just go back up to the top. So this is one way in which you would be using this. I'm just going to unpin this now. But then there's another way in which you could be using it if you have a message that you want people to see all the time, no matter what the size of their browser is. Again, a good place to put these is always on the right, and with something like this, for example, on the button. Now again, I'm going to just pin this to the screen, and let's just leave it right here. And now let's give it a preview. So let's say the person is coming in on a tablet, but you want them to absolutely see this. You want them to see this all the time. Then you would pin it so that no matter how small their screen size is, this would always stay visible. That's the logic of pinning things. You pin things so that they are always visible. Now obviously a usage for them, which I can't let me just unpin this now, which I can't show you right now because we don't have any anchors on this page. When you have an anchor menu, then you would be pinning that as well, so that it would always stay on, like, usually in the middle of the page, somewhere on the right, so that people could move from anchor to anchor to anchor. And let's just take a quick look at an example of that. So for example, if I go here, there's an anchor menu here, and I can just move from one section to the other and then back up to the top of the page, and this anchor menu here is pinned. It is pinned just in the same way that I showed you just a second ago that this was pinned or this was pinned. So that's the third thing. It's not really an animation, but I wanted to put it inside the animation tutorial because it's kind of connected, I think. I'll see you in the next tutorial.